Okay, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matt Bichelle, Product Marketing Director at Pluribus Networks. We invited Brad Casemore from IDC to speak on network disaggregation in the SDN industry. For logistics purposes, Brad will take us to about 1:45 or 22 the hour. In case we'll take questions electronically. So feel free to enter your questions directly into the questions portion of the GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar session. Brad's been the research director for Datacenter Networks at IDC, and he has more than 20 years in the information technology industry. He leads IDC's Datacenter Networks program, which assesses the impact of emerging IT and converged infrastructure solutions. He researches many technology areas, including Ethernet fabrics, application delivery controller ADCs, network virtualization, network programmability, and software-defined networks. Of note, for over 6.5 years, Brad also authored a popular blog. Maybe some of us who've been in the industry long enough are familiar with Twilight in the Valley of the Nerds. This covered enterprise data center networking, ranging on topics about SDN, fabrics, and architectures, and layer 4 through 7 services. And now it's our pleasure to have Brad present to us today. So without any further ado, Brad, take it away for us.
Hey, thanks very much for that introduction. It's greatly appreciated and was certainly very kind. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you. And what I'm going to talk about, as the title slide indicates, I'm going to talk about what we at IDC have been seeing in the markets for SDN and network disaggregation. It's an IDC presentation, so you'll see lots of quantitative data as well as qualitative assessments and analysis. So you've been forewarned that you'll see quite a wave of data as this presentation proceeds. So one of the things I want to talk about is, too often in networking, I think we don't consider context, right? We discuss the network and its mechanisms and its technologies as though they exist in their own self-contained universe. That's obviously not true, right? I mean, context is important, and I think it's becoming increasingly important and valuable as we move forward. It's a truism, but it bears repeating. Networks, especially data center networks, exist to reliably, securely, and scalably deliver and support business-critical applications. That's why we have them. The problem is those applications aren't frozen in time. In fact, the nature of those application workloads will change markedly during the next few years, and the underlying network will need to adapt accordingly. In fact, IDC has identified digital transformation as a pervasive driver of change across all vertical and geographic markets worldwide. Digital transformation shifts an ever-increasing portion of business online, and it requires flexible and agile data center infrastructure that can dynamically scale to meet business needs. Companies and organizations are pursuing digital transformation so that they can create new experiences for their customers, so that they can improve operational efficiencies, so they can generate new streams of revenue, and so they can rapidly respond to changing market conditions. Implicit in all of this is the objective of competitive advantage. If your organization isn't already pursuing digital transformation, it will be, as its peers and competitors make their moves. There's quite a competitive impetus to actually moving on digital transformation, and of course the infrastructure that supports it needs to be adequate to the task. If we consider the move to digital transformation, it's going to be built on what IDC calls the third platform. And the third platform comprises cloud, it comprises big data analytics, there's mobility, and there's an element of social business. The third platform will serve as a foundation for the transformation of enterprise business processes and enterprise business models across all industries and geographies, as mentioned earlier. And it will unleash innovations in areas such as next generation security, augmented and virtual reality, the Internet of Things, cognitive systems, robotics, and 3D printing. And in turn, of course, those will feed into those what we call innovation accelerators will feed into vertical markets such as healthcare, retail, transportation, government, financial services, including fintech, and right across the board. It's going to be, this phenomenon is going to occur, again, right across industries and right across geographies. If we consider what it means for the data center, Digital transformation on the third platform will shift value and increase workloads in the data center. There's no question about it. We've gone from the first platform, which was predicated on mainframe technologies, to the second platform, which was based on client-server technologies, and now we have the third platform, which is spawning huge volumes of new data and content. Access methods are proliferating too, as we can see on this slide, as are mobile devices, and we have some more data coming up actually on exactly what this means quantitatively in the marketplace. And in the data center, virtualization and now cloud are placing increased stress on network infrastructure, which has responded, some would say belatedly, but at least it's responded with innovations such as SDN and NFV. Let's take a look at some of the numbers. Again, it's an IDC presentation, so we've got lots of data to throw at you here. We're seeing an exponential growth in what's happening in terms of data center demand. You can see the quantification here. We can see that mobile devices are proliferating to the point where we'll see 40 billion of them in 2018, about 5 devices per person. We have about 3.5 billion users of mobile devices in 2018, and as a result, there'll be a vast mountain of data that will be produced, and that will result in corresponding growth of data center cores. An important point here, underlying it all, is that yesterday's infrastructure won't be up to the task. You need to adapt your infrastructure for the purpose. And the purpose, of course, is the third platform, as we mentioned earlier. And what this slide shows is how the third platform will come to predominate over the next few years. It's important to understand because it has significant implications for all of us. You can see that third platform spending will surpass second platform spending this year, 2016, and that the gap will increase in subsequent years. The compound annual growth rate for third platform spending will be about 12.7%, as you can see on the far right of the slide. And the compound annual growth rate for second platform spending will be minus 4.8%. These legacy applications and the technologies that support them aren't going away. They'll still be around, but that's not where the growth will be found, and it's also not where the career opportunities will be. The growth and the opportunity for IT professionals and your organizations is clearly in the third platform. And I think it's important to note. You can see it starkly laid out on this slide. So what does that mean for networking? Well, networking for the first platform was based on connectivity for mainframes and mini computers, and it encompassed many networking technologies that have long gone the way of the dinosaur and are no longer with us. The second platform's client-server era introduced LAN and WAN connectivity, innovations such as Ethernet switching and multi-protocol routing, and it was all about accommodating the relatively predictable north-south traffic flows associated with client-server computing. Now we have networking for the third platform, and we see technologies such as network virtualization and SDN emerging to accommodate the new application workloads. So therefore, it's all about virtual workloads and workflows. It's all about big data, hyperscale web, containers, DevOps, east-west traffic, server to server, rack to rack, the north-south, client to server, and that puts a focus really on automation, programmability, and orchestration, and also having the analytics to be able to drill down from the applications all the way down to the network and do it in real time as well. If we look at where SDN use cases today, and these are the ones that we hear about most often. There are quite a few use cases for SDN, obviously, but these are the principal ones, the ones that we see mentioned most often. Agility for business and operations is right up top. It's about automating the network to make provisioning faster, to make the network more programmable, and to ensure that the network is orchestrated and falls under the control of cloud orchestration. It's about getting the network out of the way, I think, and bringing it quite literally up to speed with the application workloads and the other infrastructure in the data center. And there you see the drivers: increased server virtualization and the adoption of third platform, especially cloud. I think we have a poll question coming up.
Yep, so let me go ahead and launch the first poll, which is if you're implementing SDN, which of the following factors is the primary motivation? I think it says pick multiple, but we'll ask you to pick one. So do you have the agility to support virtualization in cloud? Are you looking to have automation and programmability for OpEx and be more efficient? Looking for security improvements, whether it's microsegmentation or east-west tracking and visibility. Are you looking to simplify your network environment, so just reduce VLAN sprawl, or maybe you're looking to provision and speed up application deployment. So Brad, I'll give folks a little bit more time to vote as votes come in. I'm seeing votes kind of sprinkle in all throughout. And let's see, still getting some good votes coming in. Definitely still getting some in, so I'll give folks just a couple more seconds while pause now. And last 5 seconds. Thanks, everyone. Let's go ahead and close the poll, and then let me share this poll, and I'll read it to you, Brad, just in case you can't see it. So from top to bottom, 31% are looking for agility, 25% automation, 11% security, 19% simplified networking, and 14% provisioning for application deployment. So spread pretty far across.
Yeah, that's interesting, and you can see that there are certain words that are, really recurring themes here, right? Agility, we can see that right up top, to support virtualization and cloud. The automation and programmability for OpEx gains and efficiency, again, being able to automate and do things faster and better and more efficiently. Simplifying the network environment, VLAN sprawl, I think that makes a lot of sense. But then, again, we've got speed coming up again, speed and agility, provisioning speed for app deployment there too, and security is a consideration as well. But, definitely, the words agility and speed and automation leap out at you there.
Okay, all right. All right, so should be back to you. Now.
All right, hold on just a second.
Yep.
There we go. Sorry about that. Operator error. So if we move on, this was what we got when we did our survey, which is kind of interesting, and I think there's a bit of a difference, but there are also some commonalities here. We asked in an SDN survey that we did toward the end of last year, 2015. We asked respondents worldwide. You can see there were 327 enterprise respondents and about 75 OTT cloud respondents. We asked them, if you are implementing SDN, which of the following factors is your primary motivation? And we can see that, among the cloud providers, needing the network to have more agility to support virtualization and cloud was far and away their leading motivation at almost 31%. The enterprise, interestingly enough, and this was, obviously the respondent base that we had, looked at improving security in the data centers through mechanisms such as microsegmentation. They were almost 29%, 28.7%. And then you can see a number of factors, the one that we mentioned earlier associated with cloud providers, needing the network to have more agility for virtualization and cloud was right up there. Requiring better automation for for operational network efficiency was at a similar percentage. And you can see that they also had some interesting cases around SDNs for VLAN sprawl, as you folks, as we just saw in our poll here, and increasing the speed of provisioning the infrastructure for application workloads was in there as well. The biggest difference between the live poll we did and this one was that security was called out more by the enterprise respondents that we surveyed, but otherwise, I think there were quite a bit of commonalities in terms of the responses we had just now and the responses that we had in our survey for IDC worldwide. Speaking of worldwide, we're going to talk now a bit about, we talked about the SDN survey. We had a live poll just a few minutes ago. And now I want to talk about, the size of the SDN forecast, because clearly it's been driven by the things we talked about earlier. It's still, I think, relatively early days for SDN. I mean, we've been doing this forecast for the last few years, and the top line we felt fairly comfortable with through these years. We knew it would be, it's all driven by the workload, it's driven by need, right? Again, the networks don't exist off in a void of their own. They're very much contextually related to what the organization is trying to do. And the market is just now beginning to ramp appreciably now. And that makes sense when we consider the market and the technology drivers discussed earlier, and also the principal motivations that organizations have for adopting SDN. All these things are now beginning to happen, and as a result, we're seeing a ramp up in SDN. By the end of the forecast period, which is 2020, the SDN market worldwide will be worth about $12.5 billion, which is a pretty significant market. It's still a relatively small percentage of the overall data center networking market, but it's a growing percentage. It's clearly, again, to the point we made earlier about third platform spending, it's clearly where the growth is. If you're curious about what we comprise within SDN, because clearly SDN, as you know, is an architectural model. It's not a single product category. So what I wanted to do with this slide is give you some insight into how we segmented the market for our forecast. As mentioned on the last slide, the worldwide market in 2020 will be worth about $12.5 billion, and about 30% of that will be represented by the physical network, the network switches that provide the hardware foundation for all the software-based network automation, programmability, and orchestration. Despite all the talk about software, obviously we're still going to need network hardware, and it's still going to be, as we said, 30% of the SDN market in 2020. About 19% of the market will be represented by a virtualization control layer, which includes layer 2 and 3 network virtualization overlays and SDN controllers. Above those, we have SDN applications, which will make up about 28% of the market, about $3.5 billion. These include virtualized network and security services deployed in-use SDN networks, and that's very important. The whole forecast is in use. It's not, influenced by SDN. This is an in-use forecast, so it has to be deployed in SDN environments. So these network and security services include things like load balancers, ADCs, IPAM, VPNs, firewalls, and other network and security services. This category also includes SDN-related analytics and visibility tools, and we'll talk a little bit later about network and security services based on a question we asked in our SDN survey as well. Finally, the last category is professional services. SDN is still a relatively nascent market, as we discussed, and professional services initially will be overrepresentative relative to what you might see in mature markets. And that's because so many enterprises will be looking for trusted partners, whether they be vendors, consultants, system integrators, or channel partners, to help them not only with advice on architectural choices and options, but also with deployment, management, organizational changes, and also operations issues. So I think that's going to be a very key part of the market, at least initially. And over time, I think it's going to obviously decrease as a percentage of the market as SDN matures and people get more comfortable with the technologies and the processes and the operations and the operational challenges. Speaking of operational challenges, SDN does pose a number of them. The organizations that benefit most from SDN are the ones that we've seen that are best prepared for it. As part of a recent, what we call a planscape document, which helps enterprises and other organizations plan for technologies, we put together a narrative of SDN that spells out how enterprises should approach the technology and its relevance to their organizations. It starts with, what SDN is, obviously, and why you need it, how you can move it forward and adopt it within your organization, and who needs to be involved in the process. There's a lot of additional detail in the document, but I think the most important thing to take away here is that you need a plan, and you have to really think it through thoroughly from start to finish. Earlier on in this presentation, in this webinar, we talked about the what and the why of SDN, so let's spend a bit of time now on the how and the who. As to how you move forward with SDN in your organization, I think it's important, clearly important, to educate key decision makers, on how the network can go from being a cost center to being a business accelerator. It's a really important shift, right? Because in the past, the network was seen as a cost center, a place where you spend money and you don't necessarily see a return on it. Again, it's about making the context clear. The network supports key applications and can be a significant contributor to business value going forward. So you can use success stories from similar organizations, preferably in the same vertical market, about how they've used the technology to enable their business transformation and to enable them to move forward with third platform applications. And you can start with simple proof of concepts that involve new applications or compelling use cases. Make sure early on that it's closely tied to the things that we talked about earlier and the things that are going to be important to your business going forward. As for who needs to be involved, active participation of top IT management. You really need that. You need cross-functional participation of relevant IT departments, including developers and DevOps, depending on where your organization is with those technologies. Obviously, network professionals, they need to be involved, but there's a change going on here. There's going to be more collaborative IT. We've seen that in our surveys. We've seen that in our discussions with enterprise customers, and adoption of new skills is going to be important too. And I think there's been a lot of talk about that in the industry. And I think at this point, we're going to ask you folks another poll question.
Yes, so let me go ahead and launch that second poll, and folks, go ahead and jump in. Are you primarily interested to SDN network virtualization to help you with? And you can, it says pick multiple, but we're going to want you to pick one. Are you interested in ADCs? Are you interested in firewalls or other security items, WAN optimization, VPNs, or DDoS? So go ahead and pick one, and we'll give folks a moment to vote here. We're seeing pretty good participation in this, and not to spoil your next slide, but I believe that you guys have done a similar poll, Brad, as well.
That's right. It should be interesting to see how the live poll maps with the respondent, the responses we got in our survey.
Yeah. Someone chimed in, no layer 2, layer 3 options. The polling mechanism kind of limited me in my poll, so I think Brad may have more choices. All right, let me go ahead and close the poll and then go share the results with folks. So I think, Brad, you may be able to see this, but in case not, 27% for ADCs, 21% firewalls, 36% WAN optimization, 12% for VPNs, and 3% for denial of service. So.
Wow, yeah, it's kind of interesting. What we're going to see in a minute, but security was represented to a higher degree in our results, but it's very interesting to see WAN optimization so high. WAN optimization, of course, separate discussion, but WAN optimization is probably going to change as a result of what's happening with SD-WAN and cloud and so forth, cloud driving SD-WAN. But that's an interesting result. And now I can show you guys. I think what I can do is show you guys what we had. If I can go back, here we go. So I think we're going to move to my slide.
Yep.
Okay. So are we showing my screen now? Sorry about that. Just want to ask if we're...
There you go.
Ah, there we go. So here's what we got when we did our survey. We asked respondents whether adoption of cloud and SDN, including network virtualization. So we're assuming that network virtualization at the lower layers occurring here. Allow you to deploy any of the following as virtual appliances in software. And you can see for enterprise respondents, VPNs was way up there, 55%. Firewalls almost a similar percent for enterprise respondents. WAN optimization was pretty high though, right? I mean, 48.3%, and they could select multiple. I think unlike in the poll, these folks could select multiple options. ADCs weren't up, didn't fare as well. They were at 28.1%. You can see DDoS 24.5, other security functions 23.2. None of the above, only 4%. So folks clearly are looking at virtualizing functions inline through, whether you want to call it service insertion, service chaining. They want to do this in an SDN context. And, you can see that results are a bit different for the cloud providers. Not markedly so, but a bit different. They're looking, obviously, probably firewalls and distributed firewalls and VPNs and offering some WAN optimization services and so forth. But it's a lot of security in here. A bit different from the spot survey we just did, but still, again, some commonalities. Now we're going to shift gears a bit, and we're going to talk about network disaggregation. I'm talking about it separately from SDN because, technically speaking, it isn't SDN. SDN is an architectural approach or model, and network disaggregation occurs only on network devices. Now that said, it can clearly be part of an SDN architecture, and it often is, but in and of itself, it doesn't qualify as SDN. Not a bad thing or a good thing, but we just like to make that clear. So let's talk about what network disaggregation is. Network disaggregation involves the decomposition of vertically integrated network devices, such as switches, into bare metal network hardware on which third-party network operating systems can run. So put another way, it involves the decoupling of the switch hardware from the software or the network operating system that runs on it. This happened long ago in the compute world, as you folks know, but it's just happening now in networking. Networking, you know, was a bit behind other professions for some good reasons and some valid reasons, but you know, we're moving forward now. Some people use the terms network disaggregation and white box interchangeably, but clearly there's a difference, and it's worth noting. Disaggregated, you know, network hardware switches, they can be provided by white box ODMs as well as by brand name OEMs, such as Dell and HP in this case. So it's not limited to white box switching. I think, you know, the stage clearly was set for network disaggregation, certainly in Ethernet switching by, you know, the rise of merchant silicon, and certainly by Linux's popularity in data centers. You know, the value proposition can be savings on CapEx depending on how you do it, and if you do it right, it can definitely be savings in OpEx again if you're able to execute on the technology, and you can get operational agility and other business benefits. We said earlier it's not SDN. I think that what we're seeing in the industry is response right across the board. You're seeing, we've seen a progression of announcements relating to network disaggregation, and I think those are going to continue through this year. You know, major vendors are responding, the startup community is responding. You know, I think that a lot of this is very much customer driven. There are customers obviously at the very high end of the market in the public cloud who've moved in this direction. There are enterprises across a number of vertical markets who are looking at this technology and its applicability to their environments. We have a number of announcements occurring. I think there were some over at Mobile World Congress this week of basically CSPs, communication service providers, major telcos moving in this direction as well. So, you know, I think one important thing that we want to get across here, it's not just the cloud behemoths who are doing this, the cloud giants. This is moving through the market right now. And here's, you know, evidence of that. Network disaggregation is really getting mind share in the industry, and we asked a question, we've now asked this question 2 years in a row in our SDN survey. We've asked respondents, as part of your network architecture, have you considered, you know, and we had this question before network disaggregation became a better term, so we want to make it really clear, a hardware agnostic third-party network operating system, and then we named some vendors such as Cumulus, Pluribus, PK8, or Big Switch. And you can see, I mean, the percentages are very significant, this consideration element, from both the cloud service provider community and the enterprise community. Very few are not aware of it. You can see only 12.8% of enterprises, and a much smaller, I'm kind of surprised that any cloud providers were not aware of it, but you know, small percentage not aware of it. And I think the very significant thing is, even though it hasn't been around that long, there are very few respondents who are saying no to it. You can see it's 43.1 for the enterprise. It's a relatively small percentage considering the technology hasn't been with us that long. Now, there's an obvious difference between considering and buying, but I think that you know, obviously this technology is getting more mature, certainly by the month and year, and as I said, I think you're going to see more industry jockeying around it as we move through the year. This next question kind of surprised me, and I think it's partly because, well, I'll explain. I'll go through it and then I'll explain why I think the responses broke out this way. We asked respondents in the survey again, do you intend to run your this third-party network NOS on ODM white box switch hardware or on brand name OEM switch? And you know, maybe the cloud provider is not so surprising, 85%. You know, basically looking at you know, white box or ODM hardware. You know, but the surprising percentage, at least for me, is the enterprise at 61.8. relative to only 31, or I should say 38.2 for OEM switching. What I think happened here is I think a lot of respondents are still, they're familiar with the concept of network disaggregation, but they may not be familiar with all their options. We've heard from a lot of enterprises that they're more comfortable, not necessarily all of them, but certainly a lot of enterprises are more comfortable buying from an OEM with, support and service and all the things you get with an OEM purchase, OEM hardware rather than ODM. But that's changing. Certainly the ODM option is getting more sophisticated over time, and it could be that enterprises are more comfortable with that option, at least a growing percentage of them. But I think in actuality today it's probably a bit different, and maybe some of the respondents weren't cognizant of all the options that are available to them right now. At the end of IDC presentations, we like to kind of summarize and offer some guidance. And I think right up the top here, we want to point out that third platform workloads really require a third platform approach to data center networking. We talked earlier about digital transformations occurring on the third platform. It's going to be pervasive across vertical markets, across geographic markets. It's going to be occurring everywhere, and you're going to do it on the third platform. You saw earlier, third platform spending is ascendant. The second platform legacy spending is clearly going into, it's a maintenance market at this point. It's going to be declining over time. The action is going to be on the third platform applications, third platform infrastructure. And in this context, analytics and visibility are increasingly important to application delivery and performance. I think you're going to see that in security. You're going to see that in performance optimization. You're going to see it right across the network. SDN options, there's many of them in the data center. You can look at a number of different architectural variations on SDN. There are different vendors who are competing in the marketplace. It's still early and the competition is fierce. I think that's great for enterprise customers. You can look at the options that are best suited to you. You can make sure that you're comfortable with the architectures, with the technologies, with the various products and how they come together. I think vendors really, we're at a point now in the market where we've moved beyond abstract technology discussions about SDN, and now you need to focus on the business value that SDN and network virtualization are delivering to the marketplace and the early adopters. We really like to see companies illustrate and emphasize the business value that the early adopters have had, because I think that speaks to other enterprises and organizations in the market who are looking at the technology. They want to know what it can do for them, and they also want to know what their peers have been able to do with it. And I think we're definitely at that part of the market where that becomes a critical discussion. I think the other point, and we just touched on it, is there's significant mind share for network disaggregation. Many enterprises are considering the option, but I think much depends on how vendors deliver it and how consumable it becomes. I think there's a lot of work happening on that front right now. We can see companies working together, software and hardware vendors working together, and on the hardware side, both ODMs and OEMs working with the software vendors to make this readily consumable, to make sure that it can be deployed, to make sure that it can be leveraged and used to full effect. And I think this brings us to that last point. I think certainly in multi-vendor SDN and network disaggregation environments and the solutions that comprise them, partnering in ecosystems become increasingly critical to customer value and market success. Customers are looking at this space and they want to see how the pieces fit together and how vendors are working to fit those pieces together. And I think it's really important in this marketplace for that to happen, and fortunately we are seeing it happen right now with SDN and network disaggregation. So I think with that we've come to the formal end of this part of the webinar. So I think I'm going to hand it over to our host to take us forward.
Hey, thanks. And Brad, we've been looking at the content as we prepare, but it's just you always bring things to light. So it's really been a great presentation for me. So with that, we'll get into some questions, and some will probably continue to stream in. What I wanted to is start with a larger one, and you talked about the market for SDN being $12.5 billion by 2020. Can you kind of give us a sense for the magnitude of that vis-a-vis, say, server virtualization or even storage virtualization? Because I think that gives folks an idea of how, I'll say, potentially behind SDN is.
Yes, obviously, compute virtualization occurred first, and it's a massive market, and it's relatively mature. So it's much larger, obviously, than network virtualization and SDN at this point. That said, SDN's clearly in its growth phase. It's a market that's ramping right now, and from a growth perspective, it's going to see much greater growth. The other markets, obviously compute virtualization is much larger. Storage virtualization has been with us longer. And in that respect, I think, the network, again, was behind. There's no two ways about it. We've got to be clear on that and unambiguous. But, in the last few years, there's been a lot of activity. Somebody mentioned to me, in fact, it was mentioned by a major customer in the service provider community. They're really impressed in the last few years. Maybe they weren't as impressed before, but they're really impressed by the degree of innovation that suddenly in the last few years occurred in the networking realm as a result of SDN, network virtualization, network disaggregation, and other technologies. I think we haven't seen. There were years where there were no networking startups, in the marketplace, and I'm sure we all remember those years. And innovation was relatively incremental and slower paced. And now we've got, these huge strides of innovation occurring from startups, from established vendors, from right across the board. And it's all a result of networking, I think, getting in step with compute, getting in step with storage, and getting in step with the needs of virtualization, of cloud, and of the types of third platform applications that we discussed.
Sure. So a little bit along the lines, kind of comparing, I'll say, the three legs of the software-defined data center stool, is could potentially an opportunity for getting in or starting with SDN is saying, hey, I'm doing a technology refresh, I'm getting rid of some old networking equipment. Do you see that happening at all, kind of this tech refresh being an opportunity, or is that just in the mix with everything else?
I think what we do see definitely is as folks come up to their tech refresh, they are really looking at their alternatives, and that's a healthy thing, right? I mean, I think for years in what we'll call that that second platform era until just a few years ago, they kind of approached a network refresh as almost a preordained thing, right? They would look to they would usually look to their incumbent vendor for the next generation of the technology, and they'd move forward and do a refresh of their network, sometimes phased, sometimes all at once. But it was, again, a relatively predictable affair. What we're getting now is enterprises, service providers, right across the board, and geographies aren't changing the picture either. Geographically, it's occurring right across the board too. They're really looking at all of their options, and they want to understand their options. So it's not a rote process now. It's not, yes, I'm just going to go back to my incumbent and do a simple refresh. It's what are my options? Here's where I'm going technologically with my workloads. Here's where I am with cloud. I know I got to change. I know I've got to not only look at my network architectures and what I need to do there, but also operationally, there are significant changes happening within these organizations. And they're looking at the complete picture, they're looking at the context, and they're more business-driven than they've ever been. And I think that's causing them to revisit these questions in a lot more granularity and a lot more detail than they have in the past. There are fewer assumptions being made and a lot more research going on into the alternatives at their disposal.
Okay. So I have a couple questions in regards to maybe clarification for SDN. So one is, and I'll kind of ask these questions together, and you can take them take them one by one. One is, can you kind of compare and contrast SDN versus network function virtualization, NFV? And the other is, can you kind of talk about maybe SDN overlay versus underlay technology?
Sure. The first one, and I think, we see this a lot, right? You see people almost breathlessly conflate SDN and NFV, and we don't do that. We don't do that because NFV, strictly speaking, was an ETSI initiative. In other words, it came from the telco community, the European Telecommunications Group. And it's really about the telcos virtualizing network functions, in other words, middle boxes in their environments, so that they can do service delivery faster, potentially save on CapEx, but more about service delivery faster. Now, are there ways to do NFV-like things in the enterprise? Yes, but we would not call it NFV. We would call it virtualized network services or virtualized network functions, or just virtualized firewalls, virtualized load balancers, what have you. And we track those things at IDC. But NFV is a telco phenomenon, and SDN is an architecture. Can NFV exist with SDN? Yes, you can. In fact, some would say you should implement NFV within an SDN context under an SDN architecture, but they're not the same thing. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two. We do at IDC, and I know a lot of our counterparts in the industry do as well.
Okay, excellent. Can you talk a little bit about SDN within a data center and across data centers?
Yeah, absolutely. More and more we are seeing, it started in the data center. Certainly the data center was where, in the cloud world, the pain was most acutely felt, and that's why you saw SDN in that context. And it's provided significant value there, but increasingly, and you're seeing it from certainly customer demand and vendors providing solutions, you're looking at extending, the overlay between data centers for policy reasons, for security reasons, for reasons of cloud bursting, for a number of reasons. And we're seeing that between enterprise data centers, between private and public clouds, and increasingly I think that's going to be a point of focus. It's an element of data center interconnect, but it's related specifically to SDN, and it's actually going to proliferate. I think it's going to be a real hot button issue this year and in future years. You're going to see more of that. Yeah,
I mean, companies certainly have a lot. The bigger they are, the more data centers, or even some people have, like an airline. I know they have, each airport has their own little, cabinet. So that's a data center of one cabinet.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and for business continuity reasons, it makes sense, as you can appreciate. We see that a lot in financial services, in the obviously the New York area and other major centers. They're definitely looking at this, right? They started with SDN, the data center, and now they want to extend it. They want to do it in other data centers. They want to be able to extend the overlay between data centers. You see it in the cloud. You see it in a number of different scenarios and use cases.
Yeah, so kind of along those lines, if I'm, say, a practitioner, I'm looking to, even within, doesn't matter within or across, but one issue I wasn't clear on is, this issue of compatibility across vendors. Does SDN offer increased compatibility for heterogeneity and interoperability? Is that something maybe disaggregation helps with? Could you just kind of clarify a little bit what you see in terms of this compatibility or lack thereof, and how SDN?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it depends. I mean, it varies. Obviously, you can use. Certainly, there are controller architectures out there that are for instance open source, and there's a degree of interoperability there. But there are some that are basically you go with a certain option or flavor of SDN, and that's what you've bought into, and interoperability is a very difficult thing, if not possible. I think you hit on a great point with network disaggregation, and there's a tremendous amount of work being done there through, for instance, the Open Compute Project's networking initiative, through other vehicles as well, to try to standardize abstractions and interfaces so that you can, for instance, use different merchant Ethernet silicon in the actual switches, and then those switches can work with various network operating systems, right? You have for instance, the ONI bootloader from the OCP. You have the switch abstraction interface, SAI, happening there too. And the goal of all those things is to create interoperability and to create openness around network disaggregation, so that you can, for instance, ensure that whatever hardware you run will be able to run a variety of network operating systems. So we're getting there. Networking is still not completely open and interoperable, as we can all appreciate, but there are some strides being made, and certainly some innovations that have been unleashed in the last few years that are moving that ball forward.
Yeah, no, it's great, that SDN can work with existing networks. So I think that's important point to make in spades. I think I'll close with one final question, just because it's always in the news, and it is all around. It's just the topic of security. So could you just kind of leave us with kind of your thoughts around how SDN can help with security, and even if there's sub-markets of security? Because I think we all historically we think about perimeter security and north-south security, but what other aspects can SDN and network virtualization help?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? I think that you're absolutely right. I think if we didn't know it before, we certainly know now that perimeter-based security is not in step with widespread mobility. It's not in step with cloud. It's not in step with how we use applications, and certainly it's not in step with necessarily in step with a third platform. It doesn't mean you get rid of it, but it's not sufficient in its own right to address the security threats that we're going to see moving forward. And you need a more layered, a more comprehensive security approach, and that's definitely going to include I think innovations that are related to network virtualization, right? And we talked a bit about microsegmentation and how that can help in a security context in the data center. And there are a number of other, certainly a number of security-related, we'll call them software-defined security or SDN security companies that have proliferated in the last few years. Is quite striking. And I think they're bringing forward some really interesting solutions to security problems that have been spawned by cloud, by third platform, by mobility, and we're certainly going to see more of that. The issue with security, and I used to work in that business for a few years, well, not for a few years now, is that one thing we can be sure of is that the threats will multiply, and we've got to try to stay as close to them as possible and respond to them as quickly as possible. I think we are definitely going to get part of that toolkit from software-defined innovations, and SDN's a contributor to that. Is it going to be another vector? Yeah, potentially, but I think it's going to do more in the way of contributing to new and meaningful solutions on the security front. Okay,
great. All right. Well, I think we'll close on that. I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. Yes, we'll make the slides available and recording available, so feel free to share a link with your colleagues and listen in. Have them listen as well. I want to, Brad, thanks again. It's been a lot of fun working with you, and I want to thank you for today's presentation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being here today, and I hope the audience really enjoyed it too.
Okay, and with that, we'll close. Thanks, everyone. Have a terrific day.